So we're going to get started now. Thank you so much for joining us today for the first of KACF's Our Time Is Now Virtual Giving Summit series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Owen Bay. I'm currently a junior at Andover, and I created Our Time Is Now with Chloe Pei, who is on a gap year and starting at Stanford next fall. Chloe will moderate today's discussion. Through Our Time Is Now, we hope to raise awareness of important issues facing vulnerable Asian Americans at this time and take collective action as students to make a positive impact in our communities. We are so grateful to the Korean American Community Foundation for making this all possible. KACF has been at the front lines of serving vulnerable members of the Korean American community since 2002, from the elderly to small businesses to people who have limited English proficiency. Before we jump into our discussion, please welcome Yoon, the president and a co-founder of KACF. She's going to talk a little more about how KACF serves these communities and about their new COVID-19 Action Fund. Kyung, take it away.
Thank you, Owen. I am pleased to see so many participants in today's virtual event, and I really want to welcome everybody. To me, it speaks to the power of community when we can come together like we are doing today to share experiences and create solutions that will lead to positive change. And this is at the heart of the Korean American Community Foundation. We bring our community together to make change through our collective giving. Now, that giving can be with our dollars or our volunteerism, our expertise, or really any way that each of us can make a difference. And we harness that power of community to support nonprofit organizations that are lifting up vulnerable families and individuals like older adults, low-wage workers, the undocumented, the uninsured. Now, these are the people who've also been the hardest hit in this pandemic. And in response, we launched the KACF COVID-19 Community Action Fund to support urgent and essential services like food, shelter, economic assistance, but also to fund advocacy work that addresses discrimination and hate crimes, because we know that this affects our entire community. We think it's vitally important to engage our younger generation around this work. And I'm thrilled that this event was planned and led by students to empower youth and to create a space for this conversation. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Owen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyung. As you all probably know, there has been a concerning rise in the number of hate crimes, racist attacks, and acts of discrimination against Asian people in our city and all over the world. Congresswoman Judy Chu of California reported to MSNBC that attacks on Asians have skyrocketed to 100 per day since the coronavirus outbreak. This most likely doesn't even represent the full picture, as the Department of Justice found that 54% of hate crimes go unreported. We also wanted to give you a sense of what our audience has experienced. So here are the results of the poll that you took upon entering. So it actually looks like 62% of us have actually experienced racism or discrimination. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chloe so that we can start the discussion.
Thanks, Owen. We are very excited to hear from 3 individuals who connect both personally and professionally with this issue. I just want to remind you all that there is going to be a Q&A portion of this talk. We will take questions through submissions in the Zoom chat. Now, I would love for our 3 panelists to quickly introduce yourselves. Let's start with Grace Choi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Choi. So nice to meet you all. I currently live in Long Island City, New York City, in the heart of all things that are beautiful and diverse and delicious. I currently work as a director of policy in the New York City Mayor's office. And previously, I had the opportunity to work for President Obama at the State Department, working on women and girls empowerment for women and girls in Asia. And I also had the privilege of working for Council of Korean Americans, which is a national advocacy organization to advocate for the rights of Korean Americans. And I'm just really honored to be here and to learn and talk to all of you all. I'm so sorry that this is the reason we had to all convene, but really glad to have this opportunity to talk. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Can we move on to Jane? Could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Yoon. And I'm so honored to be speaking with you all today, too, from my perspective as a New York City public school teacher. So I'm currently teaching second grade remotely, which is really interesting, if you can imagine. As an educator for the past 7 years, I'm passionate about seeing young people empowered to name and actively fight against racism from a young age. My favorite part about this panel was that it was put together by high school students. And when I found out I had to be part of it, I believe that young people armed with education can be the most powerful force when it comes to fighting against anti-Asian racism. So thanks so much for having me today.
Thanks so much, Jane. And then lastly, Andrew, can you introduce yourself too?
Hey everyone, my name's Andrew. I was born and raised in the beautiful city of San Francisco. I currently live in Brooklyn, New York. I am a fashion fine art photographer. My past life, I worked in Silicon Valley, went to business school, but I'm excited to talk to you all today.
Great, thank you guys all so much. So I want to start by talking about how you have all been personally affected by the rise in anti-Asian sentiments at this time, and also what you've been doing through your work to combat it. So Andrew, can we start with you?
Sure. So recently I wrote an op-ed article on CNN about the desexualization of Asian American men. And through that article, it was such a rewarding experience in that I felt like I received a lot of messages and emails and DMs from people expressing that they felt very seen and represented, not only as fellow Asian American men, but as Asian Americans in general. But I think the disheartening thing that I also witnessed is I received about a handful of emails that were very racially driven, you know, from calling me cross-eyed to telling me that I won't ever belong in countries like Europe or in very white spaces. And I think it's kind of a testament to a lot of the racism that all of us Asian Americans have faced at some point in our lives, but really this time of COVID-19 has really amplified a lot of these kind of racist comments or experiences and put them in the limelight. And I think it's important for us as a community and as an organization at KACF to really be able to amplify these issues and be able to talk about these issues to kind of bring that visibility to our community.
Great, thank you so much. Now, Jane, I was so moved by the incident that happened at your school with the Japanese student. Would you mind telling the audience about what happened there?
First, so I'm currently a second grade teacher at a school in Manhattan that has around 600 students. They say that this school is one of the most racially diverse schools in the city, which is sad once you hear the stats. So our students are 80% Black and Hispanic, 15% white, and 5% other. Out of a staff of over 150, I'm the only Asian teacher. In my past 3 years working at the school, I always hoped to have one of the few Asian students placed in my class. I personally grew up in schools that were 95% white. I always wanted and needed a teacher who looked like me and understood the loneliness that I often felt but could never verbalize. This year, I found out I would have a Japanese student, Maddie, in my class. One day in late March, her parents emailed saying that Maddie told them that a girl in the school was talking about Chinese people coming to America and trying to kill us all with the coronavirus. They told me she felt scared to come to school due to racism. I knew that I would have to address this issue with all the students in order to be effective. But how do you teach 7-year-olds about racism towards Asian Americans when they hardly have relationships with Asian people? You start with what they know. So the African American community has suffered terribly, and nearly everything about their history of great leaders has been wiped out of our American curriculum, except for MLK and Rosa Parks. Today, schools have poetry slams and songs about Martin and Rosa. It's a good start, but we need more. Children can be raised to care deeply about racial inequality. They swell up with anger when they hear stories about injustice. When it comes to Asian American history, though, most students can't name even one leader in civil rights. It's no wonder that when race is talked about, the conversation is only about Black and white. Asians are never mentioned, but with the rise of hate crimes towards Asians now, I believe that this is our time to rise. We need poetry slams and songs about Yuri Kochiyama and Vincent Chin. We need Asian educators, artists, and leaders to name racism and empower our youth to fight against it. So what happened at the school was that after lifting up a prayer for help, I decided to read a book to my class called Let's Talk About Race by Julius Lester. I love this book. I recommend it to anyone. It's beautifully illustrated and worded. And in it, it says, some people tell a story that is not true. My race is better than your race. Why would someone tell this lie? Because they feel bad about themselves, because they're afraid. It helps to name it for what it is, a lie. Clear language like this is empowering to kids. So rather than singling out Maddie, I seized the opportunity of being Asian myself. I told my class my own story. I said, sometimes when I walk around New York City, people say to me, China, China, go back to China. And then I made up a story and I said, guys, I was riding the subway yesterday and someone said to me, I hate Chinese people because you guys brought the virus to America and you're trying to kill us all. The kids had a huge reaction to this story. They got super angry and said, I can't believe that someone would say that to you, Miss Yoon. One of my students said, the virus wasn't brought by Chinese people, the virus brought itself. And we brainstormed ways that they could all play active roles in stopping anti-Asian hate at the school. The kids vowed to tell on other kids that were spreading racist lies. They said that it's their job to correct their parents and friends that spread those lies. And they said that they would protect me too. So Maddie came up to me privately later and she said, thank you, Miss Yoon, for sharing that story. Believe it or not, the same thing happened to me too.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's just such an amazing story. Every time I hear it, it's just incredible. Grace, can you share any experiences that you've had?
Yeah, sure. Just speaking in my personal capacity, there's just like a lot of microaggressions that we all deal with every single day as Asian Americans or people of color or as women. But something that I was deeply affected by was before the shelter in place where we can't leave our homes in New York City came into effect. I was on my way to work. I live in Queens and I go downtown to City Hall, and transferring from the 7 train to the 6 train at Grand Central, which is a really busy area. It was less busy because people knew about the coronavirus, but at the transfer point, I was about to get on the train, and then a white woman immediately runs out of the train as soon as I get on. And it's not that full, but just even that act, I was just kind of startled that someone would try to run away from me just because I'm me and I'm who I am. And I knew it was because of being associated as an Asian American with the coronavirus. And then secondly, another incident that happened in my own building apartment complex was, I live on the 11th floor and I was taking the elevator down to try to get fresh air as much as possible or sheltering in place. And an older white lady was in the elevator with 2 other folks who were white. And as soon as the elevator door opened, she said, no, stop, don't come in. And I just looked at her shocked, didn't know what to say, because I could see that 1 foot away, there were 2 other people she was standing next to, but because I didn't look like them, she didn't want me in the elevator. And luckily, I have been praying a lot and meditating on God. So my reaction to her was, well, have a great day. And I just smiled back at her. Because I do think people are operating out of so much fear. And so hate comes out. And I think the opposite spirit and opposite response of what people are giving you is a very powerful response. So I was like, okay, how can I respond with love and kindness? Even though usually I would just want to, shut her up and yell at her, but I was like, that's gonna escalate and get worse. So that was one moment that I can point to recently. And so I don't take the elevator anymore because I'm afraid of more incidents like that and that affecting my mental health. So I actually just take the stairs, and now I'm learning to get more exercise. just by taking the stairs up and down every day. But yeah, those are just like two personal stories. And I know there's been a lot more egregious ones throughout New York City, including a woman who got acid thrown at her face late at night in New York City, and people being sprayed on by disinfectants cleaner, and actual slashing of stabbing and slashing of like children as young as 3 or 6 years old in Texas. So I'm very lucky that it wasn't that egregious, but at the same time, none of this is okay and none of it is right. And so, yeah, what I personally decided to do was to call on people around me in order to find ways to support one another, and also my non-Asian allies, my white friends, my Black friends, my Latinx friends, my Jewish friends. And so I found a lot of support in my mayor's office in order to speak out against this. I shared these stories with them too. And so what we did was we created a video montage of Asian American leaders, along with my boss, who's the First Lady of New York City, married to the mayor, on calling out the hate and discrimination and scapegoating of the Asian American community with the coronavirus, and then saying that you can also be an upstander, which is the opposite of a bystander, and call 911 to report hate crimes, call 311 to report bias incidents. That if you see something, you can say something, and you don't have to be the victim in order to help someone who might be in need. So yeah, I was just very, very, very encouraged that there are people in my own office, including my boss, who are supportive of these efforts. And I can talk about that more later, but yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, I guess the next question is for you too, in terms of, obviously this is kind of just going beyond the name calling and obviously these awful actions. We're actually seeing that this racism is having an impact on our vulnerable communities, as Kyung said earlier. Can you talk about which vulnerable communities you see struggling as a result of this discrimination and anti-Asian sentiment?
Yeah, sure. And I'd love for Jane to chime in too, because I know she has a lot of insights with her work with all different folks, people groups here in New York City. Definitely immigrants, undocumented. I mean, many of you know that Asian Americans and Korean Americans, many are undocumented, but it's very taboo. And so just having access to housing, to stipends, to the stimulus checks, to food, that the folks have been really, really affected. Also, the homeless population, who are, in crowded shelters, and that's, the kind of the epicenter of a lot of this coronavirus pandemic. I would say a lot of Asian Americans are frontline workers, so they're grocery store owners, they own dry cleaners. Small businesses have been so affected within the Asian American community, as you all know, and a lot of people have had to close down their shops. A lot of our community also are delivery workers and doctors and nurses, believe it or not. You all know that, but it's like, okay, we're here saving lives, but you're also like telling us that we're the reason for the virus. So there's a lot of irony in that. And then another population that doesn't get talked about a lot is just survivors of gender-based violence. Because we're in shelter in place, women and children who might be in the home with their abusers, they don't have a place to leave and feel safe. And so there is definitely an increase in violence within the home as well. And so those are some of the populations. I'd love for Jane to share more from her perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. Chiming off of that, a population that's really been on my heart is people that are living in nursing homes right now as well. It's thankfully been gaining a lot of attention in the media because there has been so many deaths of people in nursing homes. And there was an article in the New York Times recently about a nursing home in Queens and in New Jersey where a great majority of the people there living there are Korean. And it just really hit home for me because it's somewhere that my own grandma or mom could be. And you would have thought that it was totally fine, but it turns out that just people are really undervalued that are living there, people that have disabilities, mental disabilities and are therefore already devalued people. But then on top of that, for them to be immigrants and not able to speak English, they have like a double disability. So we really need to be advocating for those communities as well.
Great. Thank you both so much. Andrew, this next question is for you. I know a lot of your work talks about Asian American oppression and also the invisibility of that oppression. So can you talk a little bit more about your work, how you do that through your photography, and whether or not you think this invisibility is kind of amplified now?
Yeah, I think this invisibility is really tied into this kind of notion of model minority myth, of how as a group we are very monolithic. We have a very singular experience. We put our heads down, we work hard, we have great education, we get a great job, and we don't really face any challenges. And I think this really monolithic view really reinforces the invisibility that we have in our own communities, because it dismisses any of the challenges and the hardships that we as a community have across different ethnicities, across different communities, and across different geographies. And I think it's really problematic because a lot of people then are like, oh, so Asian Americans don't have to deal with issues like poverty or like racism, and really blanket and bucket us into this group that is supposedly doing really well. And I think that's what a lot of my kind of work ties into. My first documentary project, photo project, was about a small Chinese population along the Mississippi Delta. I went down there and photographed 12 to 15 people, interviewed them, took photos. And I think what that experience taught me and showcased to a lot of other people here in the US was that there are so many different Asian American experiences in the United States. It's not a very singular experience growing up in LA or San Francisco or New York and these large urban metropolitan cities, but to be able to showcase a small community of Chinese American immigrants who created their own place in the deep rural South in a time where racial tension was at an all-time high, I think was a very inspiring story for myself as an Asian American growing up in the Bay Area, living in New York, to really be in tune with some of these stories and experiences that their community had to endure to really carve out their own place socially, economically, and personally. And that was very inspiring to me, to then be able to take those stories and those images and be able to broadcast that onto a New York Times or Huffington Post. Because I think that then getting all these messages from all the folks all over the world and other Asian Americans in the South emailing me and telling me that they feel so seen or represented, I think is a very kind of special thing that we don't really see in our media, to celebrate all these different Asian American communities around the US and around the world. And so I think that for me is a big passion for myself as an artist. And that was a moment in which I realized that I had the ability and I had the power to uplift these invisible communities, especially those who come from my own background, my own heritage. So that was a lot of kind of what my personal work is now rooted in talking about some of this invisibility of Asian American communities, to be able to challenge themes of masculinity and like femininity and intimacy, to really be able to showcase these narratives along with beautiful visual images as well.
Great. And I encourage everyone, if you don't know what Andrew's photography, this is a little plug for him because I know he won't do it himself, but definitely check it out. It's really, really incredible.
Thank you.
So let's move on and talk about some of the backlash that the Asian American community has faced in addressing this discrimination. A lot of individuals have been calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus and backing that up by saying that it's just the facts, it's not racist. That it's the same as calling the Spanish flu or Ebola or Zika by their country of origin. Jane, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your thoughts are on this whole debate.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, you cannot deny that calling it the Chinese virus has directly led to a surge in anti-Asian hate crimes. And I can remember the exact moment that I started fearing for my own safety. It was the moment that I read the story about the 23-year-old Korean woman who was trying to walk into a building at Penn Station and got punched in the face for not wearing a mask. So I've lived in New York City for 8 years, and now for the first time, I genuinely felt afraid to even flinch, let alone cough on the subways. I didn't feel safe walking 2 blocks by myself to the grocery store. I'm sure that many of you guys can remember the moment that you started feeling this fear as well. In New York City, I attend a church that's run by white leaders, and a lot of Asian people attend. I also work for a nonprofit part-time that is run by a white man. I started having to explain to my white friends early on that I'd prefer not to travel outside anymore due to the hate crimes. And they were pretty shocked to hear my reasons why. For my Black and brown friends, though, it wasn't shocking news to them. They understood me. Some of you guys might have seen the phrase coughing while Asian, which has been making headlines and memes and being written on signs demanding that people stop calling it the Chinese virus. But as Asian Americans, it's also important for us to recognize that before there was coughing while Asian, there was walking while Black. So our Black and brown brothers and sisters know what it means to live in fear all the time, fear of being shot at while doing harmless things. So I really love this question that Chloe asked because I see this as a moment for us to reflect as a community on the unique space that we as Asian people occupy in America, because we're not Black and we're not white, and we straddle this third non-binary space where we experience oppression a lot of the time, but we can also blend in more easily with whiteness than our Black and brown brothers and sisters can. So most of you guys are old enough to remember the Ebola virus and the West Nile virus. Both of those are named after their places of origin in Africa, from the Congo and Uganda. As hate crimes began to surge towards our Black and brown communities in America, the Asian American community at large remained silent. So my question is, why were we comfortable staying silent when the same type of racism that we're experiencing now was happening towards our Black and brown communities? So as Asian Americans, we need to stand up for ourselves and also stand up for our oppressed minority brothers and sisters at the same time. We should be greatly angered by the term Chinese virus, and we need to put an end to it. But we should be equally angered by the terms Ebola and West Nile virus and the hate crimes that all these phrases have caused towards minorities. As Asians, some people have considered us honorary white people. That is, until we start to pose a threat, then we're seen as the forever foreigners. Should we keep benefiting from whiteness as long as we're treated well, and then claim our oppressed status only when we're being oppressed? We've been oppressed in a lot of ways, but we haven't been systematically dehumanized and demonized the way that our Black and brown brothers and sisters have in America. So I say this not to minimize anti-Asian racism at all, but it's also to highlight that this is our opportunity, not just to fight for Asian American equality, but for equality for our Latinx and African American communities too, who we know have actually been suffering from the virus at the highest rates. So I see this as our opportunity to look inwards from a place of empathy now and ask ourselves, why have we stayed silent? We can't stay silent anymore because now we're being seen as a threat. We're not going to see an end to racist hate crimes unless all people of color can come together as allies saying enough. And we need to seek for all the labels towards minorities that are calling us other, such as the Chinese virus, Ebola virus, West Nile virus. And so this is really our time to stand up against anti-Asian racism, and also our time to stand up against racism towards all minority groups so that all of us can rise and benefit.
That's a great answer and a really interesting perspective, I think, especially from what Andrew had just said about kind of the model minority myth and this idea that we're always kind of putting our heads down and not really speaking up. I just think that's interesting contrast between your two opinions, but still kind of on the same route. So the next question is going to Grace, and we're going to kind of transition now to talk about the calls to action that have been made by government officials, leaders in the community, et cetera. So Grace, I wanted to ask you first, because of your policy background, many people have been calling on elected officials and government organizations like the Department of Justice and the CDC that they need to make policy changes in regards to anti-Asian racism. What are some of those proposed policies that people are proposing, and what do you think the government's role might be?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And just building off of what Jane mentioned on how language has so much power and rhetoric has power, is that government leaders also have the responsibility to be wise in how they talk about communities. And unfortunately, having someone at the top of our country's leadership use the inflammatory language and say that it's a Chinese virus had a ripple effect throughout the country and also around the world. And so I think one of the best models that we can point to is Congresswoman Grace Meng, who hails from New York, Queens. You may all have heard of her. She introduced a resolution in order to call out the anti-Asian sentiment caused by the coronavirus back in March 25th. And she calls on all public officials to condemn and announce any and all anti-Asian sentiment in any form, recognize the health and safety of all Americans, no matter their background, condemn all manifestations of expressions of racism, xenophobia, discrimination, anti-Asian sentiment, and then call on federal law enforcement officials working with the state and local officials. That four-pronged approach in her resolution is really a standard that all states and municipalities should follow. And so what we're seeing is that many of our government entities were not prepared for this. And why do we have to wait to have policies in place? Why can't we already have them in place before crimes like this happen? And so, I mean, there are really great resources that the Office to Prevent Hate Crimes is putting together, as well as the Commission for Human Rights in New York City. So you can call 311 to report bias incidents in New York City. You can call 911 to report hate crimes. We understand that there are language barriers, like Jade mentioned too, and language accessibility, and then the stigma and shame around just saying that you went through a discriminatory situation or a hate crime. So like, who wants to say this happened to me and I'm different? And so there's a lot of just being there for people. If other people don't feel comfortable speaking up for them, as I mentioned earlier, being an upstander. Some of the resources I do want to share for folks that are not in New York City. I don't know if you heard of Act to Change, which is a pretty well-known campaign that came out of the Obama administration to combat bullying towards Asian American and Pacific Islander young people. And so they have COVID-19 resources on their website in order to address the anti-Asian bullying and discrimination. And if you go to acttochange.org/COVID-19, you can access all those resources. And then for people who are in New York City, there's nyc.gov/stop-COVID-hate. But honestly, I think rhetoric, you can't take away the importance of how powerful words are. And policies can be in place and then people don't follow it. So what people say and then what people eventually do, a lot of times has a lot of power. And so how you all engage and act towards people who might be discriminatory towards you or hateful towards you, if you see something and reporting it and then not responding back in a hateful way, I think goes a very long way. Calling on your elected officials, government leaders, writing them, maybe not writing them right now, but calling them, emailing them, even texting them, or going on social media. Dude, you guys are powerful on social media. If you just go on their Twitter and go at them, or on Instagram or your TikTok videos, there's some creative ways that I know young people know how to mobilize in order to rally and make their voices heard. So I really encourage you, while you're sheltering in place and staying at home, find, when you're doing those dance videos on TikTok, like, is there a way you can bring attention to the anti-Asian sentiment or something, and talk about solidarity and how to bring all communities together, like Jane mentioned. I mean, this is just a really a great opportunity after you take care of your own mental health and your self-care to think creative ways to express yourself that you're already doing with your friends and family all the time online. So I know you guys can do it more effectively than any of us can. So I'm looking to you all for answers on that.
Thank you so much, Grace. And that's great advice for all of the young people out there. So my next question is for Andrew. We're going to talk a little bit about one of the more controversial statements that was made by a public official. So Andrew Yang, not Andrew Kung, Andrew Yang, the former presidential candidate, recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. And in it, he called on Asians to, quote, show without a shadow of a doubt that we are Americans who will do our part for our country in this time of need, end quote. And so he faced incredible controversy for this statement, calling on Asians to kind of be more American. George Takei, who is a famous actor and Japanese internment survivor, called him out, as well as other celebrities and community leaders. And others just thought that this message was solely about unifying the nation and this idea of solidarity that Grace was talking about. So Andrew, especially with your photo series, The All American, would you mind commenting on this and what Andrew Yang said?
Yeah, sure. I think what Andrew Yang said, while it was, I think, very well intentioned, I think was poorly communicated, because I think it really reinforces how, as Asian Americans, we've always been viewed as the other. And it really perpetuates that otherness that I think we've all felt in many different environments that we've been in, whether it be questions of where are you really from, or calling you certain names, or reinforcing certain stereotypes. I think we can all attest to different spaces and environments where we felt that level of otherness. And I think by making that type of comment and saying that we need to prove our Americanness, it's disheartening to see a leader in the Asian American community make those types of comments. And I think it's really tough, because as a community, especially when we're going through all these racist kind of events and hearing about all these stories all across the US of how all these hate crimes are kind of on the uptick, I think that makes the situation even more insensitive, especially when we are in the backdrop or in the context of all these things happening within our communities. So I think it's really important for us to then have those dialogues with our friends in our communities, and to be able to talk about some of these issues that we're facing. And that's the one thing that I really want to encourage, everyone in this call, is to be able to have those conversations with friends and families, not only in the Asian American community, but it's outside of other communities, to really talk about what is the otherness, what is the model minority myth, what are those challenges that we've had to go through in being the other. Because when you think historically about an American, typically you don't think about an Asian American, and that's problematic. And I think that statement really reinforced that sentiment.
Great, thank you so much. Jane, do you know of any efforts by your school or by the New York City Department of Education to create a curriculum surrounding anti-Asian sentiments at this time, or even hate crimes? I know that even though kids obviously won't be in school for the rest of the academic year, these thoughts are obviously still festering from their parents, from the news, and kids are obviously very impressionable.
Yeah. I have not seen anything at the elementary school level, though we desperately need it. If you guys grew up in a public school, you know what I'm talking about, that Asian American history is not part of US mainstream curriculum, except maybe a few lines about the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment camps. Minority students don't grow up today seeing themselves in the material that they're learning at school. And that's why it's so hard for us to understand where we come from and where we stand. I had to advocate for books at my own school where more diversity was represented. But as a nation, we have a really long way to go. I think that things are improving more at the high school and university levels, though, which has been really encouraging and gives me hope as I'm speaking with all of you guys. It amazes me that the change makers when it comes to education has not been the schools, and it has not been the Department of Education, but it has been you guys, the students. Students like you have been successfully petitioning for universities to offer Asian American studies programs, and this has been gaining momentum across the country. Like Grace mentioned, the internet is also such a powerful way to create change right now, and students have been using it really well. I was inspired by a video created by a Chinese junior at a Florida high school that was published in New York Times recently. It was a video highlighting the racism that her and her Asian American classmates have been experiencing due to the media using the term Chinese virus. I also think back to Letters for Black Lives, a website that was put together a few years ago by young Asian Americans and Asian Canadians, writing about why it's so important for us to stand together with the Black community as they continually suffer police brutality. Their work has been translated into more than 20 languages, and young people are using that letter to start conversations with their parents at home on racial justice. This can be so hard to do and is so unglamorous and doesn't sound fun, but is really important work too. I think, especially now as kids are having to learn online and spend all day in front of screens at home, it's an amazing time for all of us to think about how we can play a role in educating other people about the truth of who we are as Asian Americans and advocating for change at the high schools and colleges, the educational institutions that all of you guys are a part of too.
Great, thank you so much. So this is going to be our last question before getting into the Q&A portion of this talk. So everyone get your questions ready. But I just wanted to ask all three of you what your advice is to students about how we can advocate against this discrimination, and what sorts of measures you're advocating for. So let's start with Grace. Maybe not. Let's start with Jane.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My answer is rooted in education. So I would say start by educating ourselves. We have been called forever foreigners and model minority at the same time, like Andrew mentioned. That is super confusing because we're being told that our race is outperforming all other races in education and wealth, but at the same time, we're treated like we're invisible. So how many of you guys have been asked, where are you actually from? Yeah, I see some hands. So now with COVID-19, we're trying not to cough while we're Asian, and it's scary having all these labels thrown at us if we don't know who we are and our history as Asian Americans. We have to know our own history so that when people tell us that we don't belong, we won't feel shaken. I feel like I'm just starting to learn about who we are, honestly, and I invite you guys to learn with me. I invite you to learn about Yuri Kochiyama's activism, learn about the civil rights movement that was sparked by Vincent Chin's death, learn about the Chinese Exclusion Act that lasted through the 1940s, and learn about why the term model minority is harmful. Knowing about our rich history in America, it arms us with the power to be able to speak back when people try to tell us that we don't belong here or that we need to go back to our country, because this is our country. So just a few practical ideas that I think any of us can do. Starting a book club with a few friends. Last year, a bunch of my friends and I from my church decided to start a book club together about racial reconciliation. And this provided a safe space for us to talk and learn and pray together for issues that often felt way bigger than ourselves. There's a book right now called Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, An Asian American Reckoning, that could be a good place to start. If you're in college and you're lucky enough to have an Asian American Studies department, then taking a class through that could be a really cool, empowering opportunity that didn't exist before. One-to-one relationships also shouldn't be overlooked. So like my relationship with Maddie and the impact that it made between student to teacher, look for opportunities in your own high school, community, college, where you can build a relationship with younger Asian Americans who might be feeling alone. So at my college, Tufts University, we had this cool program called Big Brothers, Big Sisters through the Korean Students Association, where we could build a relationship as a Korean college student with a Korean adopted child so that the child could grow up knowing someone that looks like them and could teach them about their culture. Yeah, so change starts with education, and both on large and small scales, it adds up and makes a difference.
That's such great advice. Thank you so much. Andrew, do you mind sharing some advice with our viewers?
Yeah, totally. I love all the ideas that Jane brought up.
I think they're amazing. I also love the book Minor Feelings. Highly, highly recommend that. I think for myself, and something that I would like to offer the participants is, I think for me, it's really important to find different avenues and find whatever avenue or platform it is that you have to figure out on how you can speak out about either your personal experiences or some of the wider macro experiences that Asian Americans are going through right now. And that platform may be through social media, through Instagram, through Facebook. It could be just having a conversation with your family or your close friends or your friends who aren't even Asian American. I think for each one of us, we all have different pockets of communities and platforms that we can ignite and start these conversations. And I think it's really important that right now is a time that's super important for us to not only educate ourselves, but to educate all those close around us to make sure that everyone's well equipped with the information of what's happening to the broader Asian American community. And I think this is time for us to really stand in solidarity and to be able to offer up time, advice, insight to other people that we care about. So I think it really starts there. And from there, I think that type of insight and advice would really be able to spread on a more grassroots level. So I think that for me is really the hope and the takeaway that I hope a lot of you guys walk away with today.
Thanks, Andrew. And then lastly, Grace, I think you're back. So if you could share any advice with our viewers too, that would be great.
Yeah, sorry, I lost internet for a second.
No worries, you're fine.
Internet in a time of coronavirus. So I guess just, yeah, Jane and Andrew covered great things, and I would point to two ways to think about it. One is internally what to do, and then secondly is externally. And internally, this is a hard time, and it's not easy dealing with the emotional, mental, physical, even spiritual stress. And so if you are just too overwhelmed and tired to think about activism, that's okay. Make time to take care of yourself. I'm struggling getting into a routine and getting physical movement outside of going from my bed to my table that's like 5 steps away to work, and then eating healthily. Just do what you need to do to be kind and good and love yourself. I mean, I know when I was younger, I thought self-care was really just a silly thing and kind of honestly stupid. Now that I'm a little older, I'm like, wow, now I really get it. But I think in this time of coronavirus, maybe we're all getting it, like how important it is. If you're not in a place of being full, you're going to be giving, you're not able to give as much out. So if you're giving from 50% or from empty, you're hardly going to be spilling out anything good. So do what you can to just be good and kind to yourself, love yourself. And then externally, after you love and take care of yourself, if you have the energy, and if you don't, that's okay, then do all the things that Jane and Andrew mentioned. And one of the things just to keep in mind is next month is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. That's a week away, May 1st. And then for 31 days, we're celebrating our culture. So find ways to share about your own personal experience, why you're proud to be Asian American, and amplify it on social media. May 18th is actually the birthday of Vincent Chen, who Jane mentioned, and his death and murder because he was Asian, it was a hate crime, led to the Asian American civil rights movement. So even recognizing and honoring May 18th, Vincent Chen's birthday, after Change is doing a campaign on that day to have an anti-bullying day towards Asian American young people. And so I encourage you, if you have the energy, to partake in that. And then learn up as much as you can on the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese internment. These are, a lot of things have happened in our country already, and we don't want to keep seeing history reoccur. So those are the things I recommend. Oh, and then lastly and externally, just use the resources where you are. You don't have to think of anything big. You don't have to be wealthy or, have all these whatever. You are enough. You have all the tools that you need in order to be effective in however way and shape, form that you want. One thing I did was host a prayer call through Zoom, put it on my Facebook 24 hours before I held it, and said, hey guys, whether you're Asian or not, I'm really worried about the Asian American hate crimes and discrimination. Can you join me tomorrow and pray? Just pray with me, whether you're Asian or not. And we had about 20 people join. So I was like, okay, that's easy. Just ask people to come and pray. I mean, just do whatever you need to do. And it doesn't have to be hard at all.
Great, thank you so much. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of this discussion, which will be facilitated by Owen. So if you do have a question, just go to the chat function on the bottom of your screen and type your question to the user named, it's Q&A, but it's also Owen. So just type any questions that you have to him.
Thanks, Chloe. Our first question from the audience is, how can students fight against microaggressions or smaller day-to-day occurrences of racism? And that's not directed at like anyone in any speaker specifically, so any of you can feel free to offer your perspective.
Hi, I can speak on that a little. Yeah, honestly, I think it goes back to being armed with education and just having the knowledge, because knowledge is power, and having that like during times like now where we're at home, and hopefully those microaggressions aren't happening to us while we're at home, and we can use this time to be reading. I just ordered a book on Amazon yesterday, The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee, because I really just desire to know more and hear more voices. I'm seeing a plug from Andrew. But yeah, like I want to use this time when I have it to just arm myself with more knowledge, so that when I do find myself in those difficult situations, I will feel like I have things to say and be able to speak up for myself when those things do happen. I remember when I was in 8th grade, my English teacher, who was white, said to me in front of the whole class, she said, I don't know why Asians don't like it when they're called model minority, because you guys are all so smart and you're all really good at math. So why is that a bad thing to say that? And I remember feeling really uncomfortable by that, but I didn't have any framework or language to be able to speak up for myself. And now, having learned, I know that the phrase model minority is harmful because it diminishes just the cultural variety that we have among Asians. And it also takes away attention from the fact that a lot of Asian Americans are poor and marginalized. And those are the type of people that KACF really helps. And so we need to dispel the model minority myth. And I wish that I could have said that in 8th grade.
Thank you so much for your response. The next question is, how can people not of color stand with Asian Americans in this?
I can touch a little bit upon that. I think it starts from being able to have those conversations with their own kind of respective communities or platforms, whether it be amplifying certain stories, certain hate crimes, and offering their perspectives as fellow POC on what it feels like to be other, or what it feels like to be viewed as someone who doesn't belong or who isn't American enough. And I think to be able to share their own personal anecdotes on their own respective platforms or in their own respective communities, I think is a really important way for other allies to really stand with us. And I think when we see other allies stand with us, it almost feels like a unifying force that for Asian Americans, I think is really important in this time.
And I would also encourage a simple question like, hey, are you doing okay? Like, how is this all affecting you? That just like checking in on your Asian friend, your Asian American friend, can go a really long way. And I also learned that in checking in with my Black and Latinx friends when situations would happen, and I'll just be like, dude, that was really awful what just happened in the news or to you or whatever. And it's just that acknowledgement from like a personal connection can go a long way.
Jane, this question is actually specifically for you. Thank you for emphasizing that Asian Americans need to build solidarity with our Black and Brown communities. How can we handle the anti-Black and anti-Brown racism within the Asian American community itself?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It makes me think about how in China right now there's a lot of racism towards African Americans as well, and this is really unfortunate. And we, I think that there's just a lack of understanding among the Asian American community about who we are ourselves. We've just had such a disadvantage from being stamped out of the history books and being seen or being just feeling invisible. And so I think that the more that we are armed with the knowledge of who we are, the more that we will feel secure and empowered to stand with our Black and Brown brothers and sisters. I think that I also just encourage people to step out of insularity and befriend more Black and Brown friends in our communities, at our workplaces, in our churches. And I think that I heard this really great quote once that said, the antidote to xenophobia is relationship. And if we do have personal relationships with people that are in the Black and Brown community, then those types of issues we will start to take them on as our own issues.
Okay, and for our last question, aside from advocating, do you have any recommendations as to how we can directly support communities that are suffering? How do you believe COVID-19 will change the racial dynamics of Asian Americans in the United States?
I would say you being here is a great first step. And then sharing this afterwards. I don't know if this recording will be available later. If you have the resources, then sharing and donating to the COVID Relief Fund for KCF. I think those are some immediate, tangible ways. Or do what Chloe and Owen did and organize this really cool event to call out anti-Asian racism and then have 200 people from across the country join. I mean, you all can do the same thing they did. So don't limit your potential and how you can be engaged and activate yourself.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us today, and a huge thank you to our incredible panelists. Please support KCF's COVID-19 Action Fund in any way that you can. Even a couple of dollars goes a long way. And so far, KCF has given grants to support language assistance, food insecurity, telehealth services in Korean, which include mental health services, and efforts to stop the spread of anti-Asian discrimination. We hope to have more conversations in the future, taking into account your suggestions for topics. And we hope you will join us. And again, thank you so much for coming.